You know that George Washington was the first president of the United States. Is that where your knowledge of this fascinating guy's life and history ends? Here are 25 George Washington facts that may be new to you. George Washington didn't have a middle name. With a name like George Washington, you don't really need one. George Washington's birthday was not February 22, 1732. Washington was actually born on February 11, 1731, but when the colonies switched to the Gregorian calendar from the Julian calendar, his birthday was moved 11 days. Since his birthday fell before the old date for New Year's Day, but after the new date for New Year's Day, his birth year was changed to 1732. George Washington's hair was all real. It looks white because he powdered it. George Washington was made an honorary citizen of France. The quintessential American received this honor in 1792. For a time, George Washington was a non-president commander-in-chief, but he didn't do much. In 1798, when fears were growing of a French invasion, Washington was named by John Adams commander-in-chief of the U.S. military, even though he wasn't president anymore. Apparently, this was a strategy to help recruiting, as Washington's name was very well known. He only served in an advisory capacity since he was pretty old by that point, but he felt he should have been a bit more involved. According to this letter, he was frustrated that even though he was the commander-in-chief, nobody really told him much about what was going on with the military. No one will ever rank higher than him in the U.S. military. In 1976, Washington was posthumously awarded the highest rank in the U.S. military ever, according to Air Force magazine. So a law was passed to make Washington the highest-ranking U.S. officer of all time, General of the Armies of the United States. Nobody will ever outrank him. George Washington made a pretty hefty salary. According to the Christian Science Monitor in 1789, Washington's presidential salary was 2% of the total U.S. budget, but he still had cash flow problems. Washington actually had to borrow money to attend his own first inauguration. He was one of the sickliest presidents in history. Throughout his life, Washington suffered from a laundry list of ailments: diphtheria, tuberculosis, smallpox, dysentery, malaria, quinsy, tonsillitis, carbuncle, pneumonia, and epiglottitis, to name a few. He may or may not have died as a result of medical malpractice. On the day he died, December 14, 1799, Washington was treated with 4 rounds of bloodletting, which removed 5 pints of blood from his body. It seems that it proved to be too much. In 1999, the New York Times wrote, George Washington might have been infertile. Washington had no children of his own. In 2007, John K. Amory of the University of Washington School of Medicine proposed that Washington was infertile. Amory goes through a number of possible reasons for Washington's infertility, including an infection caused by his tuberculosis. Washington's body was almost buried in the Capitol. Washington requested that he be buried at Mount Vernon, and his family upheld his request, despite repeated pleas by Congress. They wanted to put his body underneath a marble statue in the Capitol. He was not very religious. As Edward Lengel, writer of the George Washington biography Inventing George Washington, told NPR in 2011, he was a very moral man, he was a very virtuous man, and he watched carefully everything he did. But he certainly doesn't fit into our conception of a Christian evangelical or somebody who read his Bible every day and lived by a particular Christian theology. We can say he was not an atheist on the one hand, but on the other hand, he was not a devout Christian. But what about a story of him kneeling in the snow at Valley Forge to pray? According to Lengel, that's a story that was made up by early Washington biographer Parson Weems. While he would attend church, Washington wouldn't take communion. According to biographer Barry Schwartz, Washington's practice of Christianity was limited and superficial because he was not himself a Christian. In the enlightened tradition of his day, he was a devout deist, just as many of the clergymen who knew him suspected. He never chopped down that cherry tree. Parson Weems, who wrote a myth-filled biography of Washington shortly after he died, made up the cherry tree story. The Mount Vernon Digital Encyclopedia identifies that book, The Life of Washington, as the point of origin for many long-held myths about Washington. He was an inveterate letter writer. We don't have an exact number, but the best estimates seem to put the number of letters he penned somewhere between 18,000 and 20,000. If you wrote 1 letter a day, it would take you between 50 and 55 years to write that many. Before becoming the father of the nation, he was a master surveyor. Washington spent the early part of his career as a professional surveyor. One of the earliest maps he created was of his half-brother Lawrence Washington's turnip garden. Over the course of his life, Washington created some 199 land surveys. Washington took this skill with him into his role as a military leader. Before fighting the British, he fought for the British. At the age of 21, Washington was sent to lead a British colonial force against the French in Ohio. He lost, and this helped spark the 7 Years' War in North America. He was a dog lover. Washington kept and bred many hunting hounds. He is known as the father of the American foxhound and kept more than 30 of the dogs. According to his journals, 3 of the hounds' names were Drunkard, Tippler, and Tipsy. He lost more battles than he won. According to Joseph J. Ellis's His Excellency George Washington, America's first president, lost more battles than any victorious general in modern history. He was lucky, but his coat wasn't. In the Braddock disaster of 1755, Washington's troops were caught in the crossfire between British and Native American soldiers. 2 horses were shot from under Washington, and his coat was pierced by 4 musket balls, none of which hit his actual body. He didn't have wooden teeth. He did, however, have teeth problems. When he attended his first inauguration, he only had 1 tooth left in his head. Throughout the rest of his life, he had different sets of dentures. They were made of a variety of materials, including ivory, brass, horse teeth, and yes, even human teeth, possibly from slaves. George Washington is the only president to actually go into battle while serving as president. But only if you don't count Bill Pullman in Independence Day. According to the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, on September 19, 1794, George Washington became the only sitting U.S. president to personally lead troops in the field when he led the militia on a nearly month-long march west over the Allegheny Mountains to the town of Bedford. He fell in love with his best friend's wife. According to Joseph Ellis's His Excellency, several letters show that before he married Martha, Washington was in love with Sally Fairfax, who was the wife of George William Fairfax. In 1758, Washington wrote to Sally his famous Votary to Love letter. George Washington was widely criticized in the press in the later years of his presidency. He was accused of having an overly monarchical style and was criticized for his declaration of neutrality in overseas conflicts. Thomas Jefferson was among the most critical of Washington in the press, and John Adams recalled that after the Jay Treaty, the presidential mansion was surrounded by innumerable multitudes, from day-to-day buzzing, demanding war against England, cursing Washington. He owned a whiskey distillery. He installed it at Mount Vernon in 1798, and it was profitable. According to Julian Niemcewicz, a Polish visitor to the estate, it distilled 12,000 gallons a year. In 1799, Washington wrote to his nephew, 200 gallons of whiskey will be ready this day for your call, and the sooner it is taken the better, as the demand for this article in these parts is brisk.